And welcome back. In this video I want to do a bit of a recap of some of the brushes. There are many different types of brushes in Project Dogwaffle, and I just recently looked at a really old version 2.1, and it occurred to me that there are some changes. There are some brushes we had already back then, but a lot of new features and brushes have been gradually popping up, and so I wanted to cover kind of an introductory level discovery of some of the brushes that you might see if you look around, and you'll find a lot of different behaviors for some of them. There are some brushes like these shape presets that might be useful if you are using a brush that's what we call a internal brush, something like this here, but this is in fact the default brush. Let's give it a different color so we can see it. But you can load individual flowers and leaves, or you can drag it around and change all sorts of parameters and options, such as the step. You see the steps here is at 6. That's a fairly small value, and if you increase the step as you're dragging the pointer here, it's going to start revealing each of these images. If you use this one, for instance, or this star, you can do individual clicks, or you can drag it around. And that's also what some of the other tools are using, such as, for instance, the linear tool here. You can draw a line along this path, and it's going to be using the parameters of the brush. Now, if these parameters indicate some sort of a random hue change, something like this here, and you are in the brush tool, normally you'll see the colors or the hue changing based on how strong you set that random hue change. Well, the same thing happens now if you use the linear tool and you draw a line along this line. It's going to have still the behavior of changing the hue along that. It might change angle, it might change size. Let's do some random changes in size, a random position even. So now it's not quite that perfect along this line. It has some random positioning. Again, there are a number of tools that use the brush metrics. These parameters are in use, for instance, with the linear tool, but also with the curve tool. If you draw a curve, something like this, and then you say go render it or draw this, you'll see all these position and color changes and size changes along that path. And if you grab the curve and re-render it, or even if you render it on the fly, if you go stroke a curve like this, but you want to have it automatically rendered, you do the auto mode, then as you draw this, it goes along that. So that's the tool you use. Underneath it, there are a variety of brush behaviors. Even some of the rectangle tools and oval tools, right? This is the hollow rectangle. Now, there's also a fill rectangle, and that one will use not the brush settings, it will use the fill settings, which you can adjust here under the view fill settings. We won't go into that in this tutorial. What we want to focus on are the brushes. So tools like the hollow rectangle, that certainly will be interesting to look at, and also the oval. Again, there is a filled oval. The fill tool will be important for that, or the fill settings. But here we have the hollow in the upper left corner of this same icon. We have the hollow oval, and so you can use that maybe with a little bit less randomness on the position. Let's say random position, let's reduce it to just a little bit. So now you have them lined up a little bit more along that perfect oval. And so let's go discover what kind of brushes actually there are. We have just been playing a lot with these brushes that can have things like twigs and leaves and all sorts of blobbies and stars. And some of them, actually, there's a lot of brush sets that give you additional. Some of them were donated by Martin Dürr, for instance, here, also known as CyberSign. And so some of these can be very interesting to use as well for all sorts of decorative things. Like if you want to provide some sort of a decorative outline, like a rectangle, and just have it go along like that with these little blobbies along that. So let's start at the very beginning. If you select the brush tool, and that is the initial tool that you have when you start up the program, you have by default, let me close some of these things here, right? You have a view similar to this. You might start with a new image, and that image might be, let's give this standard 960 by 540 resolution, for instance. And so as you're starting your default brush, and I'm simply right-clicking on the same brush tool here, right? Left-clicking will select it to use it. Right-clicking will give you additional options if there are any. Many of these tools have additional options when you right-click on them. Or even additional tools. In some cases, it's very different. Like this one here with the gradients, you right-click on that, you have a bunch of different gradients, but you also have the warp tool, and you have nova and lens flares and lightning, lots of different things there. Back to the brushes. Okay, here is a brush, but the default brush is actually the airbrush, and the large one in particular. So that's the default brush, and there is a little bit of interesting side effect on this, and that might be due to some settings, and we will explore some of the many settings. So where do you actually see the brush settings? There is a context bar below the menu bar, right? When you select a particular tool, that context bar will change to show you the different options that are based on the actual context of that particular tool that you just chose. So as you select the brush, or perhaps even the curve tool, the brush context bar is showing, and in there you'll see a number of icons, and especially on the left side here you have a browser, a media browser, or browse for media, and that one gives you access to a lot of brushes of many different types. Right? We haven't even seen yet what types there are, but this is an idea. There are some foliage and orbitals and bristle brushes, and so these belong in particle brushes. These belong to a category called the particles. In fact, you see an option right here also in the context bar, the particles, and that is those four choices: particle brushes, bristles, orbitals, and foliage. So you can use that if you want to explore the particle brushes. Let's pin this down and start with the particles and enable it. Right? You have to make sure you enable it. So as you're painting with that, it's shooting particles, but they're not going endlessly and forever in some particular direction or in all directions. They are subject to a variety of forces and behaviors and parameters that you can control here. Now there are presets, you can load them, and this is version 10, or still in beta, but almost released. So there's a visual browser for that, and there's, for instance, the baddie grass, and you can paint like this, and soon enough you have basically a field of green here with a lot of bad grass and some weeds you might want to add. So click on load again and select the different, maybe some broccoli trails, give it a nice mix of different brightness and different hues and different colors. And that's how you create some really interesting looking scenery with foliage. Now that's one of them. There is also bristles, which you use in many different environments, including just to paint over something that's already there. There are some with very strong bleeding, so you actually don't add new color, you just blend or smear the ones that are already out there. And then there's all sorts of parameters with that. There's the orbitals, which are orbiting particles, and you can actually see them. Let's see if I can select a darker color here, and I'll select some of these presets. Let me go load, perhaps this one, and you can, if you look close enough, you'll see. Let me zoom in. There you go. You see the orbitals. They're orbiting particles, right? And imagine you basically just dipped your brush into a pot of honey, and there's some nice honey dripping on there, and now you have a bunch of flies or bees coming in to collect that, and as you blend around, you're smearing their pollen that's on their legs, and it's smearing this thing all around it. So you have many different styles and effects with that. The orbital brushes are also able to use the gradient, so that they will change color over time based on what the gradient says should happen to them. This is great, for instance, against dark. Let's erase to black and then draw something like this here. You have a variety of different styles and very different things you can paint with that. This is an interesting one. Actually, you can really see that swarm of orbiting particles. There's also a spring load here, a very high latency effect where it just like swims around and goes out of control and comes back. I have a lot of bristles here, particles. We have the density here, the bristle density. We can make them a little bit less dense, and you'll see that in many of the brushes, that you have all sorts of parameters that can drastically affect which way this behavior is showing. Like here we have 3 rotation angles, and if you set some of these to 0, you might realize that, oh yeah, so it's rotating, but just along one axis. Let's say this one here, you have almost like, looks like a galactic movement, and so that's where you can create some really fascinating backgrounds and illustrations for a number of different uses. So let's say I'm going to explore the last one here, the 4th one of those particle type brushes, enable that. And so this one is actually sort of a full tree or a bush or even grass, but sophisticated ones, using a number of rules, right? While the particle brush has had just one set of rules, including how fast gravity pulls it down and how fast, let's say if I give it a positive gravity, it's going to shoot it up. If I give it negative gravity, it might pull it down. If I give it stronger positive gravity, it might shoot it up higher. If I give it initial velocity, a much higher initial velocity, it's going to shoot it in all directions before gravity starts getting a hold of it. All sorts of different parameters, including using this as a force field, right? There is the force field here, and so at this point, any future particles will be subject to this image as a force field. I can even erase this image, but the force field is still there. So now if I go to some other foliage, you see how it's not doing what you might think it should do, like this nice little tuft here, but with the force field in effect, it can totally deflect it and further change it to another erratic level, so you could change also the style. That's something you'll see in many of these particle brushes. You can change the style from the line to something, use whatever the current brush is. That might be an animated or a custom image brush. There's a shrinking line collection, and with shrinking lines you can set the size from which it shrinks, so you can make them actually very thin even at the beginning, and that's always very interesting to explore as well. And again, you see we still have the force field in effect here. Right, so if you use this as a starting point, you could, for instance, one thing you could do then is to add a little bit of color or contrast, and make it a little bit more, all or nothing, and then perhaps use that as some sort of a background, or even as an elevation map. Maybe we'll go into blurring this a tiny little bit, and then turn this into an elevation map in 3D Designer or in Puppy Ray. Yeah, let's take a look at Puppy Ray, and you now have an elevation map. That's this one here that we use to deform the terrain, perhaps actually without interpolation and 0 pre-filtering, so you get a very crisp, sharp edges. It takes a few seconds to render. You can also have global illumination added to that, and if you come in close enough, you might see what that created. So a lot of different ways to explore this into some wacky backgrounds or some really interesting abstract pieces. Let's go back to the brushes, though. We really want to explore that. So let's go turn off the force field, free the force field. Free force field, yes. And go back to the brushes we had on the foliage, enable those. And so we have not just one set like what we see here, all this lifespan, drag, gravity, and all these parameters. We have multiple sets here, not of exactly the same parameters, but some similarity to that. And you can see them as rules library, right? So for any given starting point, let's say we use this one here, as you're drawing this, you have a main branch, or maybe the trunk of a tree, and then some twigs and smaller branches, eventually some leaves, maybe even some flowers on top. I think we have one that's called something like flowers and snow on top. A bit difficult to see it in this quick browser, but there is another way to see these. By the way, that's the browse for media right here. We've seen this before. You can tack this one down too, and if you have a really high resolution screen, that's a no-brainer. You really want to do that and keep this handy, so you can easily go and grab the ones you need next. So we have here a number of particle brushes, presets you can see here, previews, and then bristles and orbitals, and the fourth one is the foliage, and there are many in there to choose from, many presets, and a few more new ones added in version 10. So things you'll see here are brushes that create some really interesting pieces of foliage and trees in just one brush stroke. You might create these as assets for maybe a game development, right? So here's one where we also have flowers on top, little blue flowers. And you also notice that there seems to be some shading, some self-shading, and sure enough it does ambient occlusion, self-shading, so that the denser these twigs are, the darker it gets inside. There's no light hitting it on the inside. It's all shaded, it's all dark. So something like this is really great to explore and to refine, right? If you don't want blue flowers, you can change the colors here a little bit, but also in more details, the rules themselves. You can look at the rules library, foliage rules. There are up to 10 rules, and not all of them being used. Right now here we see a number of them with all zeros for parameters from 7, 8, 9, 10. So these rules are not used. Number 6 has some values, and the split type indicates what happens at the end of rendering that particular part of this rule, and this one says it ends. So that is the last one of the rules, and that means that's probably the one where we have the bluish or the whitish colors. You can see red, green, and blue. You can see gravity and some speed and sizes and other things. So if you change with this a little bit, you could see what impact does that have on on these flowers. Now they seem to be a little bit bigger, a little bit denser, right? And if you want smaller ones, here maybe the size, you'll set it down to 2, and you see that now we have small flowers on there. So that's basically the nature of the particle brushes and foliage brushes, is that there's some math involved in generating all these things. And the first one, for instance, might be the trunk that you see, the size of that. You might want to make it a little bit wider, and so you have a much wider stem at the beginning, and then suddenly it becomes a little bit thinner for the next one. Maybe that's too thin and you'd like the second one to still be bigger too. So go to the rules, go to the next level, and you'll see size is 1.6. Let's give it 5. And so now at this point you don't see such a sudden change in size. It's a little bit more gradual in this progression. So that's one way that you can further adjust and create new settings, right? But there are so many to choose from already. And there's even like the grass painter, where you just do a little bit of a dab of grass. Each time it adds the self-shaded ambient occlusion to that. So really great for exploring different types of foliage effects, maybe for greeting cards, maybe just because it's fun and it looks great. So these are the foliage brushes, the fourth category among the particle settings. I'm now going to disable that and go back to the regular brushes, right? We've kind of jumped ahead here, but there are really, before the particle brushes, there's a sort of a set of regular brushes. Again, right click here, you might see even a simple brush, which doesn't do anything in terms of smoothing or anti-aliasing. If you zoom in here, you can see every single, actually there is a little bit of anti-aliasing, but that might also be disabled depending on the shapes that you use, right? If they are anti-aliased, then you will see it. But here's one with a soft blob, and as you drag, you'll see the anti-aliasing or the softening of that edge, but that's just coming from the image. Whereas if you have a very crisp, like this negative sign, this horizontal line, draw like this, it's not going to show, and you get these staircases. Now sometimes that's great, sometimes that's exactly what you're looking for, right? To create some very interesting images and icons. Take advantage of these images, these brush sets, alternates. There's some that are very interesting and some that are just unique and very different. One thing that you'll want to realize is that many of these brushes are indeed using that. So there are like the pens, the effects, organic effects. For instance, the organic effect may have a flowery brush, and as you're painting with that, you see a bunch of little flowers. That's coming from these sets, right? I think it's from the default set. There, this one. So you have the flowers, you can take these, you have these flowers, look a little bit different, you have yet some others, and then you have leaves also, and leaves again. So many different types of results, many different results you get there from choosing different leaves, different colors, different shapes, and it's a category of brushes called the internal brushes that work with mostly small images. Now, sometimes you need to think a little bit bigger. You need bigger images. You might have, in fact, painted something like this, and you might say, hey, I want to take this entire set as a brush image, a large brush image. So you can pick this up right there. There's a magic wand tool. No, below that there is the custom brush selector tool. And with the custom brush, you enter the category where you can go and pick up a portion of your image, or you might even go and import it, open an image, right, a JPEG, a PNG, a TIFF, and then have that image act as the current brush, the image in your brush. So the custom brush, and you can store that because you may want to work with multiples of those. So store this one. You have a copy right there. It needs a transparent background, which sometimes you need to adjust. So right click instead of left clicking this custom brush selector. And when you do that, you get to work on the transparent parts. You can say which parts are transparent and how much tolerance you want on that. So there are two parameters for the low filter and the high filter. The interface is different in version 10 here than it was in prior versions. It evolves, but essentially the idea is to create a single image that will carry a fairly large image potentially, even perhaps bigger than the canvas in which you're painting. Right, so that's a possibility too. Now, is it possible to see that image as you're zooming in or preparing to stamp it down somewhere? Yes, it is. If you look at the brush context bar here, there is a preview, and normally you should be able to oh, there it is. Okay, and then you can, so when you enable that, you can see a preview of it, right? So as you zoom in, you can see it scales with that. And so that gives you an idea of where it might appear, but it might still look a little bit different in the end, because here in the preview it doesn't know yet how further it's going to be modified, because it is a custom brush. If you look at the settings, the custom brush has a number of parameters that affect it as well, including the random position. Right, now, if you have zero random position, zero random size, no random angle, and so on, it's a little bit more predictable as to where it's going to go, but you might still have random hue changes. Let's get rid of those. Random saturation, right? And now you're starting to get a better sense of where it's going to be when you actually stamp it down. Let's get rid of the value. Okay, I think now we're to the point where every stamp really looks the way the preview shows it. Okay, so keep that in mind. There are a lot of parameters here that affect the brush. And it also is a function of whether the custom brush, as we see it here, is used in showing its colors, that's the color brush style, or a matte style. If it's a matte style, it will be just a single color. And which color that is, that's of course the primary color, or the secondary color if you use the right button. So you can use that to quickly erase simply by stamping over, filling it over or painting it over with the secondary color, and then left button to paint over that. There's a lot of other things that can happen here though. You see every time I paint on it, it seems to be getting a little bit darker or more opaque, and that's because it's not at full opacity initially. I might have it here at 250. 255 would be the full opacity, but if I want it very semi-transparent, let's go erase this. You can see I can do one click, another one, and every time I do that, it keeps adding a little bit more opacity to it, and gets, so if I paint, it gets to be eventually fully opaque. That, by the way, is a technique you use a lot to create mountains of a certain type. Let's say you want a mountain range that is very high over here on the right, upper right corner, and very low over here. Now this is actually the opposite. I should invert that. So I could go and invert it after the fact, and certainly want to turn this into a grayscale. So let's go grayscale. Let's use the expose through lens, because there you can say which color should be kind of turning brighter. Then you can also expand the dynamic range, so you know one of these is eventually going to be white and the other one, the dark one, is going to be black. What I'm saying is that this is something that you can use as a technique to create mountains or elevation maps that then later we turn into mountains fairly quickly. Perhaps add a little bit of blur to that, maybe a lot with the Gaussian blur, something like this. Or if you want some mountainous streaks, let me turn the preview of the brush off here quickly. You can go and do some blurring of this sort here, something like a zoom blur or mystic vision. And what that does is it allows you to have a bit of a sort of streaks, horizontal, or some linear features. Maybe you don't need them that precise. Maybe you like a little bit of sort of a leveling showing, or the quality should be high, but the distance of how far it goes, or maybe you don't want it to be so dominant. So what you can do after you've applied it, you can do the interactive undo. Under the filter, you'll see fade last action. That's the same as if you click on this little icon. In the recent versions of Dogwaffle, we've added a couple of mini icons here. One of them is the interactive undo, same thing as a fade last action. And so what you do here is you say, okay, I like the effect, but I don't want too much of it. So you can adjust that a little bit. And what you do then is, the reason I wanted to explore that is to turn this into an elevation map. For instance, in 3D Designer, we know that this is the program, this is the part of the program that uses that elevation map. You can actually see it here under the color. Say use the image, and you'll see what the elevation looks like, right? You can see that this is indeed our image, but we now use it as an elevation map to create the mountain range. Now we can also add erosion to it. If you click on more to see more options, you can also see erosion. Click here somewhere to have it calculated, and now we have some erosion tracks here. Adjust it a little bit. The initial click is the one, or the initial calculation takes some time, but then it's just a deformation of that map. You can adjust also some sediment levels and get some extra behavior here, the flatness threshold, and of course change the coloring to not grab it from the initial map itself, but perhaps have it from the swap image. Now the swap image right now has nothing in it, but if we go to the create texture, it will create a coloration with 3 different ranges. That's the snow caps above, the rocky area, and the green vegetation area below. You can still adjust the amplitude here. You can also adjust 2 light sources. There are 2 light sources to play with, including one of them, the ray traced one that can cast shadows, maybe some soft shadows. So bring it down a little bit so you can see, adjust the brightness there. So you can see as you rotate the light source, you can see it cast the lights in real time, and the shadows, that is. And then you can adjust also how soft you want this to be appearing. All sorts of parameters to get lost with here. Spend a lot of time exploring. And let's say we want to also have even some ambient occlusion. There's quite a bit more to explore here. You can adjust the anti-aliasing for the final render, click OK, and so now you'll have a nice final render of that. And it all started with some image that you painted with the brushes, right? Something like this here. So, and the custom brushes is what we were talking about here. Those custom brushes really are very powerful because you can create a lot of things with them. And if you look at the browse for media, there are many custom brushes. Many of these here under favorites, many of them under organic, or some others gouache. Many of these are using some sort of a large image, and so they are custom brushes. In fact, some of them have a transition of both. You see if you right click on the brush here under the airbrush, there is a small airbrush, a medium, and a large airbrush. Now these are still relatively small. We call them large, but that was in the olden days when that was large, and at some point we wanted larger, and so we added even bigger than that. And that's the airbrush 50. That's about 50 pixels in size for the image. 75, 100, 200. So that's a fairly large one. And you can again enable the preview. And so that's the thing to keep in mind, is that some of these brushes that you have here when you right click on the preview, some of these are indeed using the internal brush, and some of these are using a custom brush, a really large custom brush. So you can start from these. You can then sometimes change the size further, and you can use that to create all sorts of different effects. Let's say, for instance, some starry look, black background, kind of a bluish tint, and create maybe a bigger step distance to have fewer of these stars appearing, and then so you create some nebulous background skies and so on. The idea here is really to explore some of these brushes and to then take them for what they do best, like the smear brush. Right, here's a whole collection of smearing tools. You have effects brushes. Let's go and pin this down. Let's go and adjust the size of this window a little bit. So I have a couple of like modeling clay that gives an initial dab and then start smearing that. You have the smear, and you have all sorts of different sizes, smear 100, small size, lots of different uses for that, right? There's a soft glow. And so all of these, or most of these, will use custom brushes. Some of them will use internal brushes. And there is a third type, which is simply an anti-aliased algorithmic pen. So it's an algorithmic pen, which means there's an algorithm that throws these pixels into it. It's not actually taking a pre-calculated image. It's programmatically generating this. And it has its own capabilities. But basically, these are the three main categories of brushes when it comes to regular brushes. You have a anti-aliased pen, you have a set of internal brushes, and you have a custom brush. The custom brush is actually very, very powerful because it can even be not just a single image, it can be a whole collection of images. It can be an image sequence, and that makes it an animated brush. So when you store an animated brush, you will see not just one image. See, right now here I have this stored image. I can show the film strip, but there's only one image in it, right? Whereas if I had an animated brush, I would have multiples of those. Right, now there's different ways to create an animated brush. I'll just show you one. I'm starting from this. This is my current image of one frame, one image inside the custom brush. What I'm going to do is copy it to itself. So I'm going to say add frame. So that same image is now added to itself, and this stored copy now has two images. And I'll do that a few times. Add frame, click that a few times. So now I have a scrollable list. I can resize this to make it a little bit longer, but still a scrollable list of multiple images. They are all the same though. Right now it doesn't look very animated if I do something like this here. But the thing is, let's say you do about 10 or 20 of those. Let's go add frame one more time, a few more times. And so now we have maybe a dozen or so frames in that brush. This is an animated brush. Even though the brush images each look the same, it is cycling through them as we're painting. And the real interesting part will be to use that by actually changing the images. Each of them should be a little bit different. They may rotate, they may scale, they may blur, they may change hue and color. And how do we do that? Well, maybe we have these images already. Maybe it's a walk sequence you rendered out of a 3D program, or you painted individually a sequence of images and you load those. So you can go to the brush menu, and there's an animated brush category to actually load a sequence, right? A sequence of TIFF files or a sequence of PNG or JPEGs or something like that. You can even load an AVI to animate a brush, right? If you have an AVI file. So little animations you can turn into a brush that you paint with. But you can also use an animated brush timeline on the currently loaded one. So I'm going to start with that. I have a bunch of images, here they are, or at least a subset. It's not showing every one of those, it's sort of a preview, but a subset of the entire animation sequence in the custom brush. And what I have here is a number of filters that I can apply to the images in that, and I can keyframe them. I can change the filter parameters. So for instance, if I want to change the color, adjust color, you see here each of the frames in that animation. So I go to the first one and say keep it as is, right? And then I'm going to go and add a frame here, add key. Then I'm going to go further to the right, and I want to change to a different color. Right, I'm going to go much more red, and you see how this changed a little bit, and less of the green and more of the blue. So it's more of a pinkish now. Right, so I'm going to add a keyframe to that. So now I have a transition where it's going to go through that. I'm going to actually want, before that, I want to reduce the red altogether, so it turns into a green, red, or a green and blue. Right, maybe something like this. And I'm going to make that happen somewhere in the middle. So now I have several changes from red to green to that, and I'm simply going to render that. Render this right there. There's a button to render that. So now you have a sequence of images that have been undergoing some changes, color changes and hue changes, and in the end that might be all I need, or maybe I want to do some more. So I'm going to keep the render, and it's my starting, that's my source, my starting point sequence of images from which I can do more changes. It might be, for instance, to change the saturation or change some other things. Let's do some blurring. Let's do some Gaussian blur. So the images initially are crisp. Let's go to the first image and let's not blur them at all and keep them, keyframe them. And then I'm going to go to the end and make them very blurry. Right, something like this. No matter what the color is, it's going to be blurry. And apply that, render that. And now I have a sequence that I want to keep because I want to do one more thing, which is to transform it. So I'm going to go scroll down here to the transform category. There it is, transform, and I might want to do a transform of rotation and scaling. So perhaps I'll go a little bit smaller at first, right? Or maybe I'll make it bigger at first. And now there's a little bit clipping happening. It's not actually going to clip it in the final render, but I'm going to keyframe this size, and then I'm going to go to the last frame and make it smaller, like this. But I actually also want to change the rotation, the orientation. So keyframe that once more. So we now actually have also a rotation. Render that, and now we have it rotating as it's scaling as well. So all of these things, I can now say that destination I want to use as my current brush. So use dest as brush. And if I minimize or close this, I now have a brush sequence that is animated, that rotates, that scales, that blurs, that changes hue and all that. That's the magic of a custom animator brush. I'm going to go to the brush and store this one, and now I have something that initially looks very similar, because that initial image, if I hide the film strip, you can tell these two are very similar because they kind of started from the same. But this one looks a little bit bigger because we added the scale to that, and it looks a little bit different if we look at the film strip. Here is the sequence of frames in my custom animator brush. All right, so with that, we get to use, even in PD Artist, by the way, in PD Artist, there are no tools for animation in video except for the brush. You can make this a custom animator brush and paint with it. All right, so things you'll do with that is perhaps make it a little bit smaller altogether. And so now we have a small sequence, but it's still doing this rotation and hue changes and blurring and all that. And now if you go back to the very beginning tricks, which was to use a different tool than the brush, maybe adjust the step a little bit, maybe make it a little bit bigger, so now you have a longer distance before the dabs appear, or to the contrary, make it very narrow, very close together, you get them to rotate very quickly. The idea is that you control the brush in many different ways, and the opacity and other things, and then once these brushes are defined, you can then focus on the tools that are going to use them. Right? Again, we have tools like the linear tool that can use it. We have tools like the curve tool. Where's my curve tool here? I'm going to go something like this. Oh, hold on, that's the immediate mode render. There you go. So it's rendering along that path directly. Even with change in size or with some other parameters in the brush, all of that will typically go through. But if I go individual clicks, same thing. I can go click here. Oh, let's go clear the current curve. There you go. Have a curve from here to here to here to here. There you go. And then I render it. And there's a couple of different choices to render it. This one here even changes the size along the path. Right? So there's a variety of different. And I might want to erase this little dab here with the right button. You can wipe it out. So there's a lot of different techniques to actually use a brush, but there's also tons of different types of brushes. And I hope I've given you a good first intro to the anti-aliased algorithmic pen, the internal brushes, and the custom brush. And in fact, there is one more I want to show here, two more. There's the custom tab and the FX tab. So when it comes to regular brushes, there is a tab called the custom tab where you can define your own brush right there. So that now defines a new blob. This defines a small blob. This defines a big blob, maybe even with some dense particles that you can see. And that can be great for creating other types of brushes. And down here you have a whole collection of other types and presets. You can say, hey, let's give us some pattern of some seamless texture. And that pattern can be used as the brush. It can be used in many other ways too, but this is one of them. One of the things you can also find really exciting is the brush effects, and in that one you essentially have sort of not lens flares, but like flares and glows and all sorts of different type of effects you can find very useful. Maybe to put at the front of a gun, an explosion, maybe a star in an astronomy scene. Lots of different uses for that as well. So these are custom brushes. They can even be animated, and so I'll let you explore that. One last one is this tab here. That's the FX brush category, the effects tools. That's a sort of a post effect. Essentially, when you enable it, there are a couple of different categories of extra side effect. This one here adds a little bit of an impasto look, so a lot of a embossing. It adds a little bit of a lighting from the upper left and shading on the dark side, so on the right side. So it makes it look a bit like like it's solid. And if you reduce or increase the step distance, you might see also some embossed appearance that way. Now the embossing is one thing, that's the impasto look. There's a gel also that can also create some interesting look. Let's go back to the higher density, smaller value on the step. So keep that one in mind as well. And then there is also the gouache and watercolors, translucent watercolors, which I love particularly for the pigment lifting. If you use the pigment lifting, you'll essentially experience this as if it's taking the ink back in. It's still wet, it's blending it and putting it back. So it has a pigment lifting capability. Let me start with perhaps a large airbrush, something like this one here, airbrush 50. And I'm going to go something like this. And so as you go over this, or maybe actually with text, something crisp, let's go to the text tool and type something, pigments or pigment lifting, something like this. Let's make it a little bit bigger. Let's go F to font and go something like this to bold look, and there, that should be enough. Yeah, let's use this, and I'm gonna go and simply paint this or stab this down here into this area. Apply the text. So now this is an image I'm going to store. I might want to go back to that, so I'm going to store it here, and I'm going to now paint with the paintbrush with high level of, let's enable the effects, high level of translucent watercolor and high level of lifting. Let's do very little lifting. Let's do no lifting first. So it's going like this, right? So you don't really see. Let's get a different color, like yellowish or something like that. Okay, so pigment lifting, no pigment lifting here yet. But now I'm going to go and pick up a little bit of pigment, and we see that it's kind of blurring that. Right, so that's the pigment lifting effect. And if you go really high on that, you can do a whole lot of damage to that. And that's one of the things I really like about this, is that you can change how much pigment comes from the brush itself. And if you have none of it, it's simply doing the lifting and blurring it again, like as if you went with plain water and blended it over, and it's mixed into that. So that's another thing you can do. You can use some very localized blending or blurring just by using the pigment lifting effect in the brush. All right, well, that's it for the quick intro. Not so quick after all. A lot of things to explore. Have fun. Hope you enjoy Project Dogwaffle, whether it's PD Artist, PD Howler, or PD Particles. Thanks for watching.